Your friend's pandemic sourdough starter named Vincent Van Gogh is cute and all, but if he didn't come from a 5,000-year-old frozen mummy in the Alps, I'm just not that impressed. Welcome to the Goodish news channel. I'm Ashley, and I only bring you news that won't ruin your day. But this one might ruin your appetite. In 1991, 2 German hikers came across a frozen body in the Alps. They assumed that this was a missing hiker who had come to an unfortunate end, but it was actually a guy who had died 5,300 years ago. But thanks to things like the sun, wind, and freezing temperatures, his body had been remarkably preserved. Researchers decided to name him Ötzi, and he's been called one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. Along with the body, researchers also found a copper axe, clothing that had been stitched together by at least 5 different animals, and he was wearing shoes with shoelaces. Those things are pretty cool, but it's actually the least interesting thing about him. Ötzi was a bit of a medical disaster. He had 61 tattoos, which sounds pretty hardcore, but they were on places like his joints, where people think that he probably had some joint pain, and maybe this was an attempt at some pain relief. This diagram shows the locations of Ötzi's tattoos. You can see many of them line up with his elbows, wrists, ankles, and knee, common places for arthritis. He also carries the oldest known cases of Lyme disease and heart disease. He was also genetically predisposed to baldness, and there were no hair transplants during that time that we know of. He was also lactose intolerant, which is unfortunate, but also extremely common for the area that he's from. He was missing his 12th set of ribs and his wisdom teeth. Along with all these genetic problems, he also had a gut full of parasites. But on a bright note, he died with a full stomach. Researchers could tell that his last meal consisted of wild goat, deer, and grains. And he didn't just freeze to death, he had actually been murdered. This CT scan shows an arrowhead that's been lodged in his left shoulder. It pierced a major artery, which likely would have ended things pretty quickly. Ötzi is kept in a museum in Italy. He's stored within a specialized chamber, which you can see here, that keeps the temperature at 21 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of 99%. It's not the temperature that'll kill you, it's the humidity. Ötzi is what's called a wet mummy. He has to be kept moist, so the museum keeps a thin layer of ice over his body at all times. This picture shows museum workers misting the mummy. If they didn't, he'd essentially turn to dust. If there's anything worse than a wet mummy, it's probably a dusty one. In 2019, researchers wanted to study the microbiome of Ötzi. In order to do this, though, they had to get rid of that thin layer of ice. So they raised the temperature up to 39 degrees, and after the ice melted, they collected samples from both his skin and his gut. They only had a 5-hour window to do all of their testing, because after that, the mummy would start to decompose. Along with samples from his exterior and interior, they collected what's known as melt water.
Ow!
Ew.
I'm not going to explain to you what that is, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory and disgusting. What they found in those samples was pretty surprising. Along with that water that the museum mists over the entire mummy, they also use a chemical called phenol. This is an antiseptic that kills off fungus and bacteria that could cause decomposition. The phenol theoretically should kill off yeast, but the researchers found 4 strains on the mummy's body. And 3 of those 4 strains can break down phenol and use it as food. Researchers took similar samples in 2010, and when the 2 groups of samples were compared, researchers discovered that 1 strain of yeast had experienced significant growth from that earlier sample. Now keep in mind, Ötzi's body has been kept in below freezing temperatures all this time, but somehow the yeast multiplied. So in this 2019 study, researchers isolated the cold-adapted yeast strain, fed it some flour, watched it activate and multiply, and they had dough rising in 24 hours. This isn't the first time that scientists have thawed something that's very old and has been frozen for millennia. In 2012, Russian scientists grew living flowering plants from seeds that were 30,000 years old. And a French team has revived multiple viruses that were found in Siberian permafrost. Those are estimated to be over 48,000 years old. Don't worry though, they only chose viruses that affect amoebas, not humans. Researchers are a little concerned if the permafrost keeps melting, what kind of organisms could become reanimated, and how those might affect us and our environment. But we'll save that nightmare for another day. So the ice basically acts as a freezer, and researchers can open it up and see what they find. In this case, they found bread. They used the yeast from Ötzi's body to make what the lead researcher called a very, very good sourdough. I'll take their word for it. Now, there are some skeptics who think that the yeast isn't ancient, it just happened to hitch a ride on maybe that spray bottle, a researcher, maybe within the water itself that's used to keep Ötzi hydrated. But after genetic analysis, the yeast matches organisms that are found in places like Antarctica. Also, researchers have a way of determining if DNA is old or new. Ancient genetic material tends to degrade and fall apart over time. If it were modern contamination, the DNA would look intact. So because of this, the researchers are pretty confident that this is ancient yeast. As I mentioned, 3 of the 4 strains of yeast can break down phenol. And this is good news because this yeast has the potential to help with industrial pollution cleanup. And because the yeast is active in cold temperatures, this could help reduce energy use in food production. So a 5,300-year-old mummy might help us improve how we make food and how we clean up after ourselves. The research team is now moving from bread to beer, and they're in talks with a German brewer to test it out. If you ever get the chance to try some beer or bread from mummy meltwater, let me know how that goes, because I'm only watching that one from the sidelines. If you're looking for more good news in your life, be sure to check out this video right here, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing so we can ignore all the bad news together.